guys have heard of biophilia or biophilic design other than just this workshop? So I might be reviewing some stuff you already know. You might get, I kind of have I have a pretty holistic view of it, so it might come actually a little different from me as well. But anyway, turn these lights off just for now. We'll turn them back on when we start coloring. I think it's cool out here. It's really hot. Like Carrie said, I'm Elizabeth Calabrese. I'm a WELL AP and also a WELL faculty member and the lead AP. And I've been practicing architecture for about 30 years. So think about how we evolved as a species. 99.9% of our evolution, was spent in an adaptive response to a natural environment. We were a hunter-gatherer culture, and it was only 12,000 years ago that we actually began raising food on a larger scale. Envision the city was only 6,000 years ago, which really isn't that long when you look at how long we've evolved as human beings. 400 years ago, mass perceptions of goods and services, and electricity and modern technology has only been around for 200 years. So in terms of our ability to hermetically seal ourselves inside of the building, breathing mechanical air, seeing with artificial lights, has been a very short amount of time that we've actually been on Earth. So it's interesting, some of the phobias that we have, like phobias against snakes and spiders. A lot of times these are phobias that we have because of our situation. They've actually proven that these are evolutionary responses that we have. There was some research where they had images flashing on a screen where you actually couldn't see them. You could only see them subconsciously. And the researcher was getting negative reactions when they were showing things like snakes, spiders, yet when the same images of like guns or electric wires where you could get electrocuted showed up, there was no response. So it was interesting that we subconsciously respond to these natural threats. But if we look at this little image, it's a barren situation, it's harsh, it's ecologically unsupported. Over a long period of time, it's kind of like a Walmart parking lot in the summertime, you're walking your car, it gets just really hot, uncomfortable, and if you're in that situation for too long of a period of time, let's say days, it could be quite panic-stricken and a sense of hopelessness if there's no water, no shelter, no food. And in this little situation, there's a sense of refuge and protection. Information richness, the person can look out over the hillside and see the weather, potential food, potential threats, and prepare against those threats. And it's more of a safe and secure feeling, kind of being perched and having a vantage point. Think about where you like to sit when you go into a restaurant if the restaurant's empty, and you can pick any table. Usually people will pick a spot where their back is to a wall and you can see who's coming and going. We rarely want our back to a door where people are approaching us from behind. And that's a very instinctual response to space and safety. And it really impacts our everyday life when we're thinking about where do we want to sit to have our coffee in the cafe or to write that paper or at home reading on our couch. We're responding intuitively often to the space around us. Fires are interesting. They provide a sense of warmth and protection, mobility and wayfinding, a sense of community. Research shows that when people sit around a fire or hearth together, often their blood pressure, will drop, unless we're not talking about politics. But their blood pressure can drop, and they become more communicative. And there again, that's how we evolved. Sitting around fires for safety and a sense of community. A lot of rituals and traditions occur around fire, and research also shows that when we're sleeping often, if we just hear a little crackle of a fire or a slight wave of water or even a dog snoring slightly or the sound of people kind of in the background talking lightly, that can actually be found to be comforting for a lot of people because it evokes this sense of calm that everything's okay. The dog's not barking wildly, people aren't screaming and we're afraid, the water's not crashing like it's going to take over our camp. And the fire, we know, is kind of warm and productive when it's at a usable level. Every day we are creating habitats, and a habitat is a natural home or environment of an animal, plant, or other organism. So as architects, designers, engineers, we're actually creating habitats for people as biological organisms. In this little scenario, we've got clean water, nourishment, vegetation, a sense of prospect, animals, and it is a comforting situation. If you were out looking for a campsite, for instance, you're being a bit perched up, looking out over a river, having some protection of trees around you, those are typically things that we sort of look for when we're trying to find that perfect spot for our tent. And there again, it's an evolutionary response to the environment. In this little scenario, looking at a unified ecosystem as a community together with its habitat. So here there's abundant biodiversity, a supportive ecosystem. You see the connected systems, you have the water, the fish, you have some fire there, the vegetation, it's a healthy habitat, it's clean moving water. Often communities are built around, or historically communities were built around these healthy ecosystems. And it can promote well-being and hopefulness. And this could equally be a desert scene with an oasis where there's some access to water. It doesn't just have to be like the scene of Fort Asheville. And there's some beautiful spots in Arizona. So ecology, and these are just some little words I want us to all understand together. Ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment. So it is that interconnection of organisms and environment. And this image, it's actually to show kind of comparing a hostile natural environment with hostile built environments that we seem to be continuing to build everywhere in terms of high-rise buildings in narrow streets. We're narrowing up streets and environments with these built spaces. But research is showing that we're actually building and designing hostility, aggression, disease, and homelessness into our lives, and obesity, children with ADHD and ADD and depression. We're often responding to the environment we are in day after day. And that's where the idea of if we can design aggression and hopelessness into our life, we can actually design the opposite of that, which is a more hopeful world. So for our first exercise, this is where I want each of you to look into your own self and think about how does your biocentric bias impact your response to the built environment. So how do you respond to space around you? And if you were going to describe like your favorite space or your, a great example of this would be like your favorite childhood memory. What was in that memory? What was around you? What did it feel like? Who were you with? What was the environment like? Or your favorite vacation. But if you take a minute, I've got paper, you can either just write it down. This doesn't have to be a big exercise because we have some bigger exercises coming a little later on. I do have colored pencils and paper here, but we're going to take, let's say 10 minutes. If you guys just want to dive in and think about yourselves and what you need in an environment to flourish and thrive. Living systems are systems that can self-organize. So, I've had people say, well, you need to define nature. What is nature exactly? Nothing out here is actually nature. It's all been touched by human hands. And I'm not talking about nature at its most purest sense, but nature in terms of what can grow and reproduce and self-organize is the nature I'm referring to. And then if we think about as design professionals, as architects, we are licensed, and other engineers or builders. We're supposed to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And what actually does that mean? How are we protecting the health and safety and welfare? And actually, how we design the built environment is way more than just guardrails at the right heights, or the space to be able to pull on the door, or hallway widths. It's really how we're impacting the natural environment and our sense of community with each other is also a strong component of health, safety, and welfare. How many of you guys know Christopher Alexander's work? Pattern language, this came out of UC Berkeley back in the 70s. And Christopher Alexander, his first career was a mathematician, and then he dove into architecture and architectural theory. And I learned about this at LSU back in the 80s. And I was fascinated by it because being a mathematician, he was really, to me, he was very engrossed in proportions of space and patterns, the patterns of space around people that would create that quality with no name component. So he started analyzing spaces that actually felt alive, and it wasn't nature he was talking about the quality of space that gave the patterns in a space that created a sense of aliveness. And often his pictures were from Italy or England, these older villages or houses, or we were talking about the older, why do older houses so often feel better than newer houses? And not that all new houses don't feel good, but a lot of them don't feel good. But also just, he didn't talk about it, but one of my pet peeves is just like the color of light that comes through low E glass versus clear historic glass that has a wave. That impacts the space. So, one is for energy efficiency. Up north in Vermont, we have to have low E2 windows, but we actually need the sun more so than protection from the sun. Yet it's changing that color of light coming into our house. I usually go to 180, one layer low E up north, but just because we desperately need that light. And so anyway, it's interesting though, but it was Christopher Alexander who was talking about a pattern language. And that actually, in a roundabout way, has influenced biophilic design. I've always seen the connection between the pattern language and biophilic design. Stephen Keller didn't. Bill Browning, who wrote the 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design, and Nikos Salangeros, who also worked with Christopher Alexander and has written a book about biophilic design. You'll see them talking about patterns. It's all just seeing it through a little different lens, but I think the goal of it is all the same in a sense, although Christopher Alexander wasn't an ecologist. Although his later books, actually after he wrote his larger volumes of pattern language, he did end up focusing on 15 patterns of wholeness. And then his later work, he gets into more natural nature and natural systems and processes. I actually haven't read his essays, but I see him merging with Stephen Keller about this time. And then when I went back and got a master's in ecological design from in 2008 to 2012, and John Todd was my graduate advisor, and he's the pioneer of living technologies, and he's a marine biologist, but he created living technologies or eco-machines. And I can give you guys all access to this PowerPoint too, if you want. And he's a pioneer of ecological design. And I know I'm throwing all these different things at you guys, but you'll see how they all kind of come together in a little bit. So he works with ecological water treatment. So there are three functions of ecological design. One is as a utility serving the need for wastewater treatment. That's W on the top of that. The next is an amenity providing an aesthetic and living feature. And lastly, it's a habitat creating a home for wetland species, including fish, dragonflies, and migratory birds. So these are different complexities and integrations of systems, as we look at ecological design. And these are living systems. There's places like in Serenity in Georgia, where their water and wastewater system are actually a water feature or a wetlands feature in the middle of that development. So instead of having kind of a stinky system off in a remote place, they're bringing that water, wastewater treatment into the heart and creating habitat and healthy ecologies using those systems. And that's sort of, as we're talking about resiliency and restorative design and biophilia, this is where we start seeing everything coming together. Another way he managed waste were these big fiberglass tanks that would grow plant and animal life that would also purify and filter contaminants out of water and soil. So it was allowing nature to actually heal, which nature does if we allow it to. This is a project he did in China, and this was a really just an awful canal full of human waste, all kinds of waste that is very unsafe, unsanitary. And then through aeration and, again, plant and animal life, they turned it into more of a park-like environment. We talk about our childhood memories, playing in the woods and climbing trees and stuff. And our world is becoming more and more urbanized, yet we can actually integrate living systems to create natural park-like settings in urban environments that are doing more than just acting as a park, but they're actually an infrastructure to urban environments. And another project he did is at the Mega Center in Rhinebeck, New York. And the space in the middle is the main functioning living machine that's full of plant and animal life, fish, swimming in the water as it's getting purified from the water and wastewater system there. And they actually have whole classes and yoga in the room they're changing the waste to water. The water does end up out in these constructed wetlands outside, which also furthers habitat, and it's lovely to look at, the diverse grasses. So if we're starting now to talk about the foundation of biophilia and biophilic design, in 1964, Erich Fromm, who's a psychoanalyst, first introduced the word biophilia in his book, The Heart of Man. 20 years later, E.O. Wilson reintroduced the word biophilia in his book, Biophilia. And then he went on to write Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge, where he talked about the sciences, the humanities and the sciences coming together for a unified body of knowledge. And then Stephen Keller realized the importance of biophilia, and he and E.O. Wilson then edited the book Biophilia Hypothesis that has chapters by a lot of many notable contributors. So that's a pretty amazing book. And then Stephen went on to write Building for Life in 2005, where he starts introducing this idea of biophilic design. And then in 2008, Stephen with Yale University, where he was a social ecologist, they had a retreat and they invited about 30 folks to it. And from that retreat came the book, Biophilic Design. And in that book, he edited with Judith Ehrwagen from Seattle, Washington, and Martin Madler, who was a graduate student of his. That also has chapters by notable contributors. And Bill Browning is in that, and Bill went on to write the 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design and lectured about that all over. And trying to think, Alex Wilson, a lot of great contributors there. So it's all still chapters that kind of deal with different aspects of biophilic design. And in that book, Stephen actually introduced the most comprehensive framework for biophilic design that has 72 attributes in it. It's the framework that's used by the Living Building Challenge, which in turn is now used by the Well-Building Standard. They're using that original framework. And then Theo Wilson wrote The Social Conquest of Earth, and I have it here because I pulled a quote from it. And then Stephen wrote Birthright, which was less about biophilic design, but more about humanity's role, nature's role in connection with humanity. And then Stephen passed away in 2016. And then after he passed away, a book he had been working on when he died came out, Nature by Design, which has the simplified biophilic framework. And what I don't have in here is in 2015, Stephen and I did a little monograph together, which introduced the simplified biophilic design framework, and that's available online. And I think it's somewhere in here, and I can get it to you. And we'll be talking about that. That's what I'll introduce because it's a lot easier than the 72. It was just too much, very comprehensive, but overwhelming for me. So this was really interesting because when I was first introduced to biophilic design, I didn't really know about Fromm. It was actually, I was embarrassed at a talk where I was talking about Wilson, and somebody's like, say, Wilson didn't come up with a word. So I bought the book, and what was really interesting about it is understanding the context in which he used the word biophilia. And in this whole political realm, in this day and age, what we're doing to the environment, it's interesting because in '64 he was talking about like Stalin and Hitler and people that were into the destruction of life. And I'm just going to read this to us. I have been able to distinguish between various kinds of aggression which directly or indirectly are in service of life, and that malignant form of destructiveness, necrophilia, which is the true love of death, as opposed to biophilia, which is the love of life. Love of life, independence, and the overcoming of narcissism form a syndrome of growth against the syndrome of decay formed by love of death, incestuous symbiosis, and malignant narcissism. And the so narcissism, okay, so how, in terms of us destroying our world, us deciding it's okay to pollute the air more, pollute the water, that's a very narcissistic approach. So when I read this, I was like, wow, look how this word is now coming forward in this whole shift in the way we design the world. I'm not sure if there's something that's behind there. It's sometimes this thing, okay. Wow, yeah. Somehow it's doing this fancy stuff, but we'll just run with it. Biophilia is a tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes. This is Wilson. From infancy, we concentrate happily on ourselves and other organisms. We learn to distinguish life from the inanimate and move toward it like moths to a porch light. To explore and affiliate with life is a deep and complicated process of mental development. To an extent still undervalued in philosophy and religion, our existence depends on this propensity. Our spirit is woven from it. Hope rises on its currents. This is Theo Wilson in the book Biophilia, and he's describing biophilia. So I find it really interesting because he's talking about philosophy, religion, hope, and that we're drawn to it. I'm just gonna Then he goes on to say, the humanities and science must come together to create a unified body of knowledge. Only in doing so can we once again experience balance between humanity and the natural world, since they are so intertwined. So that, so this is more E.O. Wilson's version of biophilia, how he sees it. I mean, he's not a designer; he's an etymologist, and he's looking at. He's a conservationist, first and foremost, in my opinion. So it's interesting to understand biophilia as it's coming forward from these different folks. And then Stephen Keller, I hope you guys are okay with me reading these, but I'd like for you to hear actually what they're saying versus my interpretation of it. The human need for nature is linked not just to the material exploitation of the environment, but also to the influence of the natural world on our emotional, cognitive, aesthetic, and even spiritual development. Even the tendency to avoid, reject, and at times destroy elements of the natural world can be viewed as an extension of an innate need to relate deeply and intimately with the vast spectrum of life around us. And that's from Steve Biophilia's hypothesis. So, I mean, often nowadays when you hear about biophilia, you hear, oh, let's put a wall here. It's really expensive to do things biophilically, so we can't because the owners don't want to spend money to put in a huge green wall. And yet, some of the things we talked about, it can be as simple as a porch swing. It's not that it has to be high tech, and also resource intensive. And Steve did dive into this in Birthright, just about the different ways we connect with nature. And some of these are things that we actually talked about when you guys were talking about your childhood memories or your favorite spaces. But we have senses of attraction, understanding nature. What do we learn by just looking at nature and seeing how those systems work? The trees, decomposition, habitat, the exploitation of nature, our affection for nature, our aversion of nature. Nature isn't always good. And it's interesting, they have studies where not all socioeconomic folks from different socioeconomic backgrounds agree on how much nature is comfortable. People from a lower socioeconomic area often don't want too much vegetation around because that can be scary because that's where bad things happen. That's where drug deals happen. That's where people get attacked. They don't want too much greenery around, or they want to be able to have a strong vantage point. Where people in really safe neighborhoods might not mind if it's kind of dense and thick vegetation. So we don't always respond the same way to nature. Dominion, the urge to master and control the natural environment. Some people putting on your coats. You can turn that heat back on if you guys are cold. It was just so hot. Spirituality and symbolism. So these are all different ways we relate to nature. And that's from Birthright. And then here's another quote from Steve. He says, biophilic design is not about greening our buildings or simply increasing their aesthetic appeal through interesting trees and shrubs, inserting trees and shrubs. Much more, it's about humanity's place in nature and the natural world's place in human society. So, so to get an idea about the deepness of biophilic design, it's just not a surface approach. So in 2015, Steve and I produced this monograph. It's online. It's www.biophilic-design.com. It's open source, and that way nobody had to buy it. It's just kind of out there in the universe. And what was interesting about this is it was the first time that principles of biophilic design were introduced. In the original comprehensive 2009 framework, There were experiences and attributes, but there was really no intentions laid out for guiding principles about biophilic design. So I would say that was probably one of the most important things about this monograph, as well as just the simplified aspects of it. So the principles of biophilic design are one, biophilic design fosters a repeated and sustained engagement with nature. It focuses on human adaptation in the natural world that over evolutionary time have advanced people's health, fitness, and well-being. So that ties back to what we were talking about earlier about how we evolved as a species. It encourages an emotional attachment to particular settings and places. So in a time where we've got so much globalization and placelessness occurring, that's not biophilic. It really embeds people into the ecology and sense of place of an area. It promotes positive interactions between people and nature that encourage and expand a sense of responsibility and stewardship for the human and natural communities. And this is another thing that happened with this later framework, is it actually brought in our need to connect with people. Because before it was just sort of our connection to nature, but we are nature, and therefore this sense of community is also needs to be acknowledged in biophilic design. And it encourages ecologically connected, mutually reinforced, and integrated design solutions. So it's not just a green wall here and a water feature there, although that can be the interpretation from the well building standard if they don't talk about that integration as being key. But as far as Steve's concerned and I'm concerned, that integration is what makes it a holistic approach to biophilic design. So in terms of that integration, if we just think about the 3 levels of ecological design, this is where the understanding of ecological design comes in as we start thinking about these systems. If you're going to have a green wall, it might as well have the air system hooked up to it. How are you using either dew or other types of water to feed the plants? How can you integrate that system more holistically into your building, or your water feature, or your senses of wayfinding? So in this simplified framework, there's the direct experience of nature, indirect experience of nature, and experience of space and place. And what you guys were talking about when we first started our discussions today, you were describing all of these already. You already know this. This is nothing new. As we talk about it, you're just going to say, oh yes, I'm not, I innately know what I need, and this is acknowledging that. So in terms of the direct experience of nature, that's natural light, fresh air, running or clean water, plants, animals, weather, natural landscapes and ecosystems, and fire and hearth. The indirect experience of nature, that would be your images of nature, the pictures in your apartment of trees and mountains and rivers and screensavers, natural materials, natural colors. What's interesting about natural colors is that in nature, colors are often at certain ratios. Like your really bright red isn't everywhere necessarily, but it's an accent color. And we often will use that in the built environment as an accent color. If this entire room was like blood red, it might not, with fluorescent light that has a blue tint, it just might be too much. But having those accent colors is responding to actually how we respond to the color in nature. And I know there are beautiful painted vistas and whatnot, but I'm just saying there is that balance of color that we respond to, and actually masculine or feminine, or male or female, they found sometimes will respond to color differently as well. And there are studies on that. Let's see, the indirect experience, that's simulating natural light and air, naturalistic shapes and forms. Evoking nature is something that kind of feels like nature, but it's not actually something specifically nature. That would be like the Sydney Opera House. It evokes something natural. It kind of evokes shells, but it's not actually exactly. Information richness. When you walk through a forest, our peripheral vision is always analyzing what's around us, filtering out what's not important, paying attention to what might be important coming in, but also analyzing everything around you, the color, the sound, the smell, to make sure you're safe And we do that in the built environment as well. So information richness is important versus just a very sterile, dead environment. An environment that's very much unalive. Age change and patina of time, that's one of my favorite. Speaking of moss, moss is so lovely on rocks or the patina of copper as it changes. Who thinks PVC ages well? But other things age beautifully. Just wood where you can tell somebody's walked on it, or a chair where over 100 years somebody's hands are rubbed on that chair. So that's one of my favorite of them. Natural geometries that deal with fractals. Fractals are patterns in nature that are repetitive, but they change scales. But there's an order to them, and they make sense to us. And Bill Browning will go right on for days about fractals and mind community. But it's interesting as you start looking at patterns or just the branching patterns on the tree and leaves, grasses, our lungs, lightning. Those are all examples of these fractal patterns that we can find fascinating. Biomimicry. Now this is an interesting one because biomimicry is where we look at nature's brilliance to solve problems. So it can either be a very small thing, but if we look at a built environment that's built to mimic an ecosystem, then that becomes ecomimicry. And that could actually be an overarching design ideal in terms of an approach to systems, integrating natural systems and processes in the design process. So biomimicry is definitely a scalable situation. And then experience of space and place, that's more about the space around us and the proportions of that space. So that would be prospecting refuge, which we acknowledged a lot earlier. Organized complexity, and it's sort of along the same line as the information richness, where we want things that are complex, yet there's an order tying them together. If you're walking down like a street in New York City and you see a whole series of buildings, and they're similar yet they're different. It can be very pleasing. If you walk through a subdivision where every house is a cookie cutter of the other house, that can possibly not be as pleasing. So that idea of organized complexity, and a lot of this is personal choice, but I often think about the fact that when we're walking through a built environment, we're still responding to it as we would respond to a natural environment in terms of the information around us. Integration of parts to wholes. Transition space is a great one because that's your porches, the space on the fringe. And often that's the richest space, just as it is in a forest, is that transition space. Terraces, porches, trellises. As an architect, often I see, not my house, but often the building, and sometimes the schools this will have it. The building ends here and the landscape begins here. And but the opportunity for those porches and fringe spaces or trellises that provide shading, sometimes those are missed opportunities for that transition. Mobility and wayfinding. How do we create built environments that help people understand and orient themselves to where they are, where they're going, just as we would if we were hunter-gatherers, wanting to have our wayfinding points. The mountains are on this side, the stream is here, we know this tree, this rock, this pattern, this earth, and we still there again respond to the built environment with those same needs for wayfinding and mobility. And then cultural and ecological connection with attachment to place. That's that same idea of being connected to sense of place instead of this just being something that's just done all over the world regardless of culture and ecology. And I'm kind of blasting through this, but I want us to. So I thought this was an interesting quote from Stephen Jay Gould. We can outwin the battle to save species and environments without forging an emotional bond between ourselves and nature, for we will not fight to save what we do not love. And the idea behind biophilic design is through technology, we're creating a bigger and bigger isolation and separation from the natural world. Therefore, we're less apt to take care of it because we're less connected to it. So by reconnecting people to nature and natural systems and processes, they're more apt to actually care for it because they feel connected to it. So in urban environments, by creating these stronger connections, people will actually be more concerned about nature because we're actually having to pull it into the city. Where in the past, cities weren't that big and the separation wasn't so great. In terms of scales, this is Max Moore's scales. So I look at self, household, neighborhood, city, region, and planet. So in terms of scales of biophilic design, you can look at it any number of ways. This morning we looked at, our first activity was self and household. So now our second exercise, if you guys can actually get into groups if you want. You can work by yourself, you can work in groups, you can change your tables around, and we just have to come back at the end of the class. But select a neighborhood or city scale project to explore as a group, thinking about the biophilic principles. I can give you guys something to do. Actually in Singapore, we had an activity where the tables designed a playground for children, an urban playground for children to connect them with nature and living systems and natural processes. So that would be a cool activity you could do. Or if there's a project that you have on your books right now or on your drafting table and you want to, or a computer, that you want to explore. So you can do this alone or as a group around one of these tables. You could probably get 6 people around one of these tables. I'm just going to go through and show a couple of case studies. I think it's great if you all were mentioning different things like schools and Zoom ways. This is just a project I've done in Kenya. I'll go through it really quickly, but what I'm hoping to do is that you continue thinking scales. Personal scale, household scale, neighborhood, urban, regional, and global scale. So as we're talking about how we're connecting into nature, it can really be any of those scales. And so anyway, this is in Laikipia County, Kenya. A friend of mine I went to college with. She's there. I'm heading there in just a couple of weeks. But just considering the ecology of Kenya and scales, personal scale, what makes a space feel good in terms of feeling protected there, surrounded by natural materials, grass, thatch roofs, they're my favorite. Actually, a lot of very biophilic furniture because it's ancient furniture, and lots of natural top patterns, organic shapes, fire. Big fire there. It gets cold at night up there. They're high elevation. Trellises, little protected niches, a lot of flora and fauna. Porches. It's actually, the fun thing about projects like this is that because everything's just made on site, you just drop windows and the welders weld them. There's some glass put in. From a safety standpoint, though, you do, the little pieces of glass are there for a reason, because you can't get through the metal in terms of a safety situation. So there are safety concerns, and that's a whole different story in terms of equity.
Safety from humans?
Yeah, it's because there's such a gap in equity. Violence doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen.
Is there any, do animals wander through that also or not?
They can. I was once in a tent without any bars at all, and I heard a leopard outside. My daughter was in the bed, and she was in her 20s, but still, I went into like protective mother mode. I'll be between the leopard and my daughter. But you could hear it like it's. It sounds like a saw, and they had warned me, but the leopard goes to the pool and drinks water from the pool at night, so it was just doing
Did
its
you get to
rounds.
see it?
I didn't see it, but
But
I
I know
heard
when
it.
to poke your head
Yeah,
out.
I was like, yeah. There's no people here. But I just, flora and fauna, it's interesting, my friend Elizabeth, she, when she first started building, they just had all the water going into a big cesspit. They didn't have gray water reuse, and she started planting all these amazing flowers, and then all of a sudden the drought hits. She's like, oh no, yes. So now they have gray water reuse. They have their own gardens. So they've been advancing ecologically by cooking. So they're just fun projects because, I mean, it's local grass. It's kind of shaggy, like a shaggy cow, but that's the local grass. So then there's a breakfast deck down here on the bottom. This was the party house, which is built into the landscape. It's not on it. There was no heavy equipment. The guys dug it out. I was there for 3 months overseeing the project, working with the general contractor, and it's all local pet stone. Scaffolding, I mean, it's wild because it's so different from here, but it's kind of a magical process. It's very much a hands-on process. There's this big tree that the building focused on, and I actually don't have a picture of the wood porch that's out there. This is looking out on the deck. But as we're looking at the different scales, this is a conservancy land right across the little creek. So we're looking up on a conservation land, so that's where you see elephants and zebra and giraffes and whatnot. Every once in a while, the elephants will bust through the fence, and you get Mr. Linda to his corner, and maybe people hitting pots to try to scare the elephants away. So there is this conflict of wildlife and people. But solution there could be elephants actually are deathly afraid of bees. So they're starting to realize if they start putting beehives around some of these small farms, that the elephants actually won't come around the bees. And then they have an additional crop, which is a bee crop. It's selling honey. So in terms of these integrated systems approach, it's a nice way to start looking at the economics, the ecological economics of the area. There's also a community. I love these pictures. We had a volunteer. We had a big party when he was leaving. So all the community members got together, and they got a couple of goats and from the Maasai, and had a big goat roast. It was just a great situation. But also then scalability, there's the school right down the road. So then you've got this business that's also helping, it's hiring the local folks, then it's helping the school, and knowing that it's very much interconnected with everything around it, whether it's the social capital, the environmental capital. And then I was just kind of going up in scale. You've got the wildlife, the people that come into this resort facility get exposed to wildlife, therefore they understand the plight, the poaching, natural habitat. So this would be more of a regional scale as we're looking at that. And then, you see that from the toilet, but when we would and now we're kind of diverting to another project. This isn't, the rest of these aren't my projects though. We were talking about children, and I like that we have idea of children coming up. And Richard Louv introduced the term nature deficit disorder, stating that the continued increase of children's behavioral problems could be due in part to limited time outdoors and in the natural environment. I was in England and I saw this picture. I'm like, you've got to be kidding. The grass is totally sectioned off, no playing on the grass, and then everything else is like artificial turf, artificial playground for the kids, but the kids aren't allowed to touch the grass. I figure it's probably full of pesticide too. But anyway, but this is what our world has become. Stay off the grass, stay off of this. So there's this school in Georgia, the Chattahoochee Fields Charter School. I was down at Serenity, and this is in, they kind of support this school. And it was an amazing school because it was built around an ecological theme. And they have gardens, they learn about agriculture. The kids spend a lot of time outdoors. So there are these outdoor covered spaces. So when it's really hot out and it's too sunny, you've got shade. If it's raining, you're protected. Sometimes when I'll see somebody, I'll say, oh, we have an outdoor classroom and it's like rocks, like out in the field. I was like, well, yeah, but all of a sudden it's too hot, it's raining. That's not an outdoor classroom. Those are rocks in the field. So what's, sorry, that's hard. But just thinking about the schools and biophilic design, I thought their mission was interesting, helping kids to live meaningful, healthy, flourishing lives. They're immersed in the arts, engaged in agriculture, and engendered with environmental stewardship, which I thought was very biophilic. They spend more time outdoors. In their brochure, they talk about the fact that being outdoors helps reduce anxiety, helps kids focus, mitigates symptoms of ADHD and ADD, so that's right in line with, I'm assuming they were quoting Richard Lee. They have lower suspension rates. They have 800 on their waiting list. And what I thought was interesting in looking around, often in schools there's a stronger female presence of teachers, and at this particular school, I saw a lot more male teachers. So it seemed to be a more balanced ratio of female to males. And I did ask about it because I was curious if just the nature of the school attracted different faculty. But I thought that was interesting. So that would be kind of a biophilic school. But then we've got companies like Amazon and Google who are realizing that biophilic design helps them attract and retain the best talent in the world. And Bill Browning actually did a wonderful publication, or Terrapin, his crew there at Terrapin Bright Green. It's called The Economics of Biophilia. And they've got all the studies about the benefits of for businesses that have more biophilic office space, or in terms of employee retention, productivity. He makes a very powerful case. You got the Spheres in Seattle. Oh, let me back up real quick. What I loved about this in terms of integrated systems, this is a green wall, but it's also attached to a big huge fish tank. So you've got these two ecosystems working hand in hand. So I thought that was just really cool, instead of one water feature over here and the green wall there. They really did create quite an ecosystem there, and I was excited to see that. Then there's a 3-acre urban farm in Brooklyn, New York. It's called the Brooklyn Grange. And it's just an amazing space. It's a fully functioning farm. We even had chickens, and they didn't have to worry about foxes getting chickens. I think hawks maybe. But it's, they have farm-to-table events, they have yoga there. But if you look across the city, there's all that potential real estate. They can become farms and amazing spaces. They have weddings there. We went up there at a conference, the Great Agree Conference in New York City, and it was a wonderful place to visit. And then hospitals now are also realizing that biophilic design or biophilic experiences and attributes make a big difference in the hospitals in terms of pulling nature directly and indirectly into the hospital. This is the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital in Palo Alto, California. Lots of natural light. You've got the birds that are an indirect experience in nature. Each of the floors of the hospital have a theme, a regional theme. So each floor has a mascot that helps with the mobility and wayfinding. You have these bronze sculptures of the mascot. But each is themed. So with mobility and wayfinding, it helps you orient yourself where you are, but it's also connecting you to that natural, to the regions in the area, the ecosystems in the area. Outside there, at the windows, you can see that trellis transition space that could be providing shade at this point. One of the things really interesting here is that every one of the patient rooms has a window to outside. There's a planter and a wooden slat trellis. So you have patterns of light from the trellis, you've got the shade from the trellis, you've got the plantings, and all the planters are irrigated with the dialysis water and the rainwater runoff. So they've really integrated their systems that way. And they also, this is the Perkins and Will job, and they also had some huge skylights that they had to convince the hospital to put into the back parts of the hospital that wouldn't have any light. And the folks at the hospital were like, it's expensive, we don't need this, we don't need this. And Robin got there and was like, you need this and you need to do it. And sure enough, they put it in, and after they had light in the back of the hospital, the staff are like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. They know what time of day it is. Their whole circadian cycle is more in sync. There's research that shows that when there's natural daylight, that they were looking at groups of nurses, and where there was natural daylight, they were more social with each other. So it wasn't just feeling better because of the circadian rhythm, but it's actually feeling more communicative and socially connected, which I thought was interesting. Here's a hospital in Singapore. This won the first Stephen Keller Biophilic Design Award that the International Women Teachers Biophilic Design Initiative had, Kutek Hospital. And what's amazing here is that Singapore is a city in a garden, is what it calls itself. Things just grow there, so probably their biggest fight is actually keeping it, the plants from overgrowing and overtaking. But it's an amazing place. It's got water features, fish ponds, a big lake outside that they have a walking and running trail around. People actually go to the hospital to eat in the cafeteria. People that aren't staying in the hospital, and I thought that was pretty amazing. They have a rooftop garden that the community members come and work. So it's not a hospital that's just curing illness. It's actually a hospital that promotes wellness. So it's a salutogenic situation there. And that's a great word, salutogenics, promoting health and well-being. Then another opportunity for biophilia and reconnecting people to nature and living systems and natural processes is this Great Basin Sagebrush Project in Oregon. So it's a correctional facility, and instead of having people in small cubicles, with no windows under fluorescent lights, they're outside, they're getting that exercise, they're doing positive things. It's a really inspiring story. I won't spend too much time on it. The urban farms, the ability to promote healthy living, life skills, vocational training, and community engagement. So the thought of what these community gardens can do, and then looking at scales now, I started looking at refugee communities. What could we actually, how could biophilic design actually be a positive influence on the lives of people who need this the most? Sometimes I was getting a little frustrated when biophilic design was being pushed mostly in the corporate world, Amazon, we're going to make our employees, that being the focus of biophilic design, and it's not. I mean, it's great we can keep people, executives happy, but the people that I really feel need this the most are those most in need. The children, the elderly in elder facilities, refugee encampments, correctional facilities. So that's why I'm and just the scale gets bigger and bigger. So Ken Yang is is a grandfather of biophilic design, and he's in Malaysia. And this is his work, not his specialty in camping, but in terms of considering ecological design as the biointegration of infrastructure. This infrastructure is based on his, a lecture I attended of his. So he talks about 3 different types of infrastructure, and blue, green, red, and gray. So your green infrastructure is ecology, nature, climate, ecosystems, flora and fauna, natural resources, physical environment, geochemical, and cycles. And then your blue infrastructure is your rain, waterways, groundwater, dew, lakes, bioswales, and detention ponds. And I like this one because it's something that we don't always think about, but our red infrastructure, our people, humans, activities, commerce, economic systems, lifestyles, mobility, recreation, food, and diet. And then the gray infrastructure is the built environment. So that would be built structures, production systems, energy artifacts, food products, materials and waste, buildings, cities, and utilities. So the greenway, you guys were you guys were touching on a lot of these different infrastructural opportunities. So, I mean, one of the things that keeps coming up is technology. And do we, is biophilic design about technology? And it's not. It's really kind of going back to more basic things. Remembering to look at the stars. It's not rocket science. And thinking about what we've done as a society in the name of progress. There was a time when the agriculture, this is in the name of progress. What we've done to indigenous cultures in the name of progress. There's been things we've done that have actually been detrimental to how we live on the planet, including taking people away from their connections to nature, ripping them from that in the name of progress. So biophilic design is actually turning that around and saying we actually, progress is actually reconnecting to nature and its systems. This is a great quote by Winston Churchill: "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." And that would be the built environment. And this is something Steve always said, biophilic design is about creating healthy habitats for all to flourish and thrive. We're building habitats for people as biological organisms. We are biological organisms. Now, I'm just looking at our time. It's 4 o'clock. I'm going to go through this quick. How many of you know the Well Building Standard or the Living Building Challenge? Okay. So these are 2 certification programs, and the Well Building Standard is a brother-sister program to LEED. So LEED is dealing with energy efficiency and materials and resource use, whereas the Well Building Standard is looking at the health and well-being of the occupants inside of the building. And it's interesting because they have biophilia as a part of that certification program. And so if you're interested in it, you can become a WELL AP, just like a LEED AP. So they do have biophilia in the Well Building Standard. It's the incorporation of nature, the incorporation of natural patterns, and interactions with nature. Then they also have outdoor biophilia, which would be your plantings around the building, plantings in the building, and a water feature. That is an example, in my opinion, of something that's like a checklist approach, which isn't ideal, but at least they're talking about it, which is great. But when I look at the Well Building Standard, I see a lot of other things listed in their checklist are biophilic, but it's not noted that in the standard. But that would be beauty and mindful design. Our want of beauty around us, and often beauty has some natural aspect, whether directly or indirectly involved in it. Ceiling heights and artwork and spatial familiarity.
in terms of the proportion of space. Increased ventilation, operable windows, just the ability to have some kind of control over our space. Quality drinking water, increased fruits and vegetables, minimize processed foods, mindful eating. This is a really funny one. So for mindful eating, they want you to have enough seating for, I think, 25% of the number of, pretty sure it's 25. Anyway, a certain percentage of the number of employees to be able to eat together as a group. And so I got a call once from them and they said, some folks want to know if plastic plants will qualify for the plants in the building. And my initial response was, of course not. Then I stopped and I thought about it. And there are situations where artificial plants or silk flowers or something can be amazing. But it's not a direct experience of nature, it's an indirect experience of nature. So as long as it's called that, then that would be appropriate. But you can't say plastic plants are a direct experience of nature. I said, well, okay, so in the mindful eating, if you think that plastic plants should be a direct experience of nature, then mannequins should be able to count for mindful eating, as somebody you're eating lunch with. And it was funny, I have a picture of like all these things. Circadian lighting design is important. Color quality of light, whether it's the degrees of Kelvin in the lumens. I don't know how many of you know, there's warm light and cool light. And what is more pleasing, you stay more awake when we're around the cooler light, but it can possibly not feel as good as the warmer light. But we respond to colors of light. So knowing how important that is and being able to choose when to use what light where. Warm light is more like firelight, cool light is more like daylight. So whatever you choose it for a reason. Let's see, color quality light, right to light, daylighting, interior fitness circulation. They want you to have stairs that encourage people to actually use them. So instead of having an egress stair back in a dark corner, they want you to have a stair where people can actually communicate up and down that stair, meet people, listen to music, see artwork, have a vantage point. So they're increasing people moving and exercising around the building, and not just getting on the elevator. Exterior active design, and comfort and control. That deals a lot with having control over your light, over your heating and cooling, and not feeling captive by an environment. Then there's the living building challenge. They actually had biophilia first before the well building standard, and they also had with the petals a sense of place, water, energy, health and happiness, materials, equity, and beauty. I haven't looked actually at the most up to date, the latest, the 3.0. I know the 2.0. And actually biophilia was under health and happiness. And I'm not sure where they have biophilia now. But in terms of sense of place, our connection to water, energy use, the materials, what materials are you choosing, the natural materials. It's also throughout the living building challenge as well. So just in terms of education, I do think education is the key. How we educate our children and how we educate our designers and engineers to actually work hand in hand with natural systems and processes. This is just a quote by Stephen Keller, and this is kind of our closing quote before our final activity. Successful biophilic design and effects transforms our ethical relationship to nature. It depends on the realization that a love for and connection to the dynamic living beauty of the natural world are components of a healthy and productive human society. All of our inherent values of nature reflect the self-interest of living in harmony with the non-human environment. A broad anthropocentric ethic can shift our relationship to the natural world from simply exploiter and admirer to partner and collaborator in creating places of health and productivity for human and non-human life alike. The successful practice of biophilic design contributes to this reverence and respect for nature. which has come to be recognized as an essential component of the well-being existence. This was his last paragraph of the book, that his last book. So I thought it was really profound to hear it from him rather than me. So, our third exercise, and you guys kind of got ahead with your infrastructure thing. Select an infrastructure to explore and note its positive impacts at each scale. So you could actually take what you did previously if you want to just think about how it impacts the various scales in terms of self, household, neighborhood, city, region, planet. Or you can kind of take this however you want. But the idea is thinking about positive feedback loops at each scale.